So welcome everyone and Shalom Aleichem. Today I want to talk about a verse in the parsha that talks about deception. That will be our subject. And what does it mean? What is covered by this um, prohibition not to deceive? It's not clear because the term is ambiguous. So let's begin. So we have the words velo tonu. Those are the two words, don't deceive. But what does this tonu mean? What does it entail? What does it encompass? So the background. So the background is that the opening verses of the parsha in Leviticus 25 talk about the Jubilee year and the Jubilee laws. And the Torah says, and you shall hallow the 50th year, you shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a Jubilee year for you. Each of you shall return to his holding, and each of you shall return to his family. And so one of these verses is very famous. Which one and why? Or I'm showing you the verse. Why is it famous?
Because it's on the Liberty Bell.
Aha! So here it is. Yes, in 1751, the Speaker of the House of Pennsylvania ordered a bell from England to celebrate the Jubilee of the Pennsylvania Charter of Freedoms. It wasn't called Liberty Bell then. The name, the iconic name Liberty Bell, only came during the abolitionists, almost 100 years later, during the 1830s, when they adopted the bell as their symbol. But it was just called the Pennsylvania House Bell. That was its name until it became the symbol. And really, they took it from our parsha. They took it, and let's see it up close. You can even see here. Do you see when I change the screens?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So you see here, proclaim liberty throughout the land, and goes around the bell, and even so they meant religious liberty. That was what was in the charter, the Pennsylvania Charter of Freedoms. But when the Torah talks about liberty, it's different. It's not, the Torah doesn't believe in religious liberty in the sense that we believe in today. Everybody has to worship Adonai, and even there's violence towards those who worship idols. But the freedom that it's talked about is really this kind of the freedom of enslaved people. So they get released. So there's three main decrees that happen on the Jubilee year. So we see one is release of enslaved Israelites. And number two is return of the lands that have been sold they go back to their first owners. So land cannot be sold permanently under this system. It sounds strange to us, but you can only own land up to 50 years. In other words, your maximum time on a piece of land is 49 years, basically. And then it goes back. So this is the background for the prohibition about deception. So here are the actual verses. So do we have a volunteer to read the verses?
Okay, when you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee. And in selling to you, that person shall charge you only for the remaining crop years. The more such years, the higher the price you pay. The fewer such years, the lower the price. For what is being sold to you is the number of harvests. Do not wrong one another, but fear your God, for Adonai, I am your God.
So the wronging, the do not wrong, what kind of wronging is it? What kind of, if this is the deception?
It's fraud, it's cheating.
Oh, fraud, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's fraud, financial fraud. Today we call it fraud. So, right, you sell a field to somebody who doesn't know about the Jubilee law, and it's 3 years. There's only 3 years left until the field will come back to you, right? And he doesn't know about it, and you charge him the full price, as if he would have it for 50 years. because he's not aware of the count. So that's the fraud. He thinks he's going to get it for 50 years. He doesn't know that in 3 years it's going to come back to you. So that's wronging them, and that's the Torah even goes into the details of you have to calculate how many years are remaining, and that will determine the price of the field. But what's difficult about this? What's the difficulty in this paragraph? So that's the question I want to ask. Look at the paragraph. It's a classic difficulty that commentators always like to comment on.
Well, the verse is repeated.
Exactly. So why the repetition? It says at the beginning, sort of the opening phrase, when you're buying, don't wrong, or don't, other translations, don't deceive. And then again, at the end. So what would be your simplest explanation for why is this verse
Because
repeated?
that's what people tend to do. That's, it's to remind people to avoid their baser instincts, which they really need reminding.
I like that. Yeah.
I think that the first deals with people and the second deals with God.
But the second one also says, do not wrong one another.
Now, here's how I see it.
Yeah.
First is an admonition to the seller, and the second is
Oh,
the information to potential buyers.
Buyers. Ah,
Wake up. You've got some responsibility to know what you're buying.
Very interesting. So directed to the two different people of the transaction, to the two sides of the transaction. Very interesting.
Right,
I like that. I know
consumer protection.
yeah. I like all your explanations. But I think Natalie is right that the simplest one would be repetition for the purpose of emphasis. It's so in our inclination to take advantage of people who don't know these laws, so that it needs to be repeated. But okay, so that's probably the simplest one. But our rabbis in the Talmud and in the Midrash saw it differently. They wanted to say, it's talking about two different types of deceptions. And another way to translate it is do not maltreat. But in the English, so I took the early translation. The first one you saw was, I think, JPS, and they didn't pay attention to the actual Hebrew words when translating wrong one another. So they just did both of them. But when you look at the Hebrew, it's not the same words. So look, in the first verse, in verse 14, it was al tonu ish et achiv. And in the second time, it instructed us not to wrong. It was velo tonu ish et amito. That's not the same word. And Professor Fox paid attention to this. So the first verse he translated, do not maltreat any man his brother, ach, brother. And then the second one that comes at the end, so you are not to maltreat any man his fellow. That's the amito. Rather, you are to hold your God in awe. Now, what do you make of this? Can this help us differentiate maybe between the two deceptions? How do you see this? Is it just, for...
One is particular and the other is universal. So you're talking about the entire humanity, I think.
The second one, the any man his fellow.
Is the world. The second
world.
is every human being.
Okay, so very nice explanation. Don't think you're forbidden only to maltreat Jews. You're forbidden to maltreat anybody, any buyer, from any nation, from any religion, any fellow man. Very interesting. So that's what needs to be repeated. Yeah.
Because there are places in the Talmud, as I'm sure you can explicate better than I, where it seems to be a very gray area where you can do commercial transactions with Gentiles in a different way than you do them with Jews.
There are some, yes, unfortunately, some references like that. So, so I think this is perhaps that's why the Torah changes the language here.
Suppose we look at in verse 14, achi, as literally your brother.
Oh, but
Is the Hebrew
ah
different?
no, it's yeah, I've never thought of it that way. Many you have to look at other expressions.
Mhm.
It's
I was
not
thinking, I was
yeah,
thinking of Jacob and Esau.
Yep, yep,
yeah,
yep. Would put a
yeah,
different spin on the story.
yeah, yeah. But when the Torah uses isha tachiv, so I didn't look up
I
that
think,
phrase in other
yeah,
places.
yeah, you're probably right. I
Yeah,
just was focusing on them.
yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's go to the subject matter. That Talmud understood it, and Rashi brings the Talmud that it's a whole different type of fraud. Rashi says this is different. The first one was financial fraud. But here, as opposed to the earlier, as opposed to verse 14, scripture warns against vexing by words, that one should not annoy his fellow man, nor give him an advice which is unfitted for him, but is in accordance with the plan and the advantage of the advisor. And that explains that addition, right? If we go back to the verse, the second time around, it talked about fearing God. The first time it didn't have, it just said, don't maltreat any man and his brother. But the second time around, there was that addition at the end of the verse, Ve'areta me'elohecha. So Rashi picks up on that and says, you know why it says that? Because when we're talking about words, vexing by words, who knows whether I had any intention to do him evil?
Mm.
So scripture therefore states, but you shall fear God. He who knows men's thoughts, he knows it. In all cases where there's a matter of conscience, when no one knows the truth except the one who has thought in his heart, scripture always states, but be afraid or be in awe, yareta me'elohecha, of your God. So it's much more difficult to detect when people are trying to deceive with words only. That's not as clear cut as with financial fraud. And now let's see examples. And this type of fraud is called hona'at dvarim. We know that dvarim are statements in the Torah. In modern Hebrew, it became synonymous with things. But in the Torah Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, dvarim, from the word ledaber, is statements. So hona'ah, the deception, with statements. And the Sifra has 3 examples. Any volunteer to read the examples? Now we're going to talk concrete examples. Any volunteer to read?
Okay, how does one violate this prohibition? First one, if you meet someone who repented, don't say to him, remember your original actions. 2, if you meet a convert, don't say to him, remember your forefathers' actions. 3, if he is suffering from pain, disease, or lost close relatives, don't say, and I don't know what the verse is.
Here's the verse.
Okay, surely your fear was your foolishness, your hope and the sincerity of your ways. Remember now who was innocent that perished, and where were the upright destroyed?
Okay, so here's my question. We read some examples. Where is the deception here? Aren't they more insults? Let's go back and look at them. If ona'ah is deceiving, because financial, we saw how you can financially deceive somebody by not telling him when the Jubilee year and how many years he's going to hold on to the field. But when you're telling these people, these vulnerable people, yes, but still, isn't it just an insult, something ugly, something rude? But it's where
It makes the people question their beliefs, the integrity of their community, everything that they base their lives on, those kinds of comments. I actually have a good example. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this before, but on the third one, and the idea that if a person is wounded or ill, that person has brought it upon himself. It's absolutely, it's horrible. My example is many years ago, my older son was mugged seriously in New Jersey. And when he was recuperating, someone from his community came into the house and said, first he asked about if he had checked the mezuzahs. And then he asked if he said, well, you know, you have to look into your heart and see if you've committed any errors.
Oh
I mean,
my,
you know, yeah.
yeah,
And pretended that, I mean, it's exactly what this example is.
yeah. Okay, so I think you're leading us into an understanding of what goes to the heart of these examples, that there's some pretending going on here. You're pretending to be like helping the person. Like, I really
Yeah.
want to help you. Get better, get on the right track.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really an insult. It's really, you're putting them down. That's what you're trying to do. You're saying, I'm better than you. You sinned. I'm a tzaddik, and you sinned, and that's why you got into this trouble, this pain, this disease. And the same thing with the other two examples here. So you can pretend that you're actually praising them. Think of it.
But you know, it's even worse because it can make these kinds of things can make a person question his or her belief in God. You come into somebody who's hurting and say, well, what did you do to cause this pain? Or somebody who's tried to be a sincere convert and say, you'll never be a convert. I mean, you'll never be a real Jew.
Yeah,
That makes a person just want to walk away from the community.
right, right. And even the verse that's quoted here can be interpreted in two ways. In other words, it's a very difficult verse. The Hebrew is very difficult. Um, think of it now. Let's not think of it the way you in your story you brought, Natalie, but let's think of it now as, remember now who was in it. Like, there are innocent that perish in the world. So I'm not saying that it's your fault. I'm just telling you, this is how the world goes on. This is how the world operates. There's innocent people that perished, and there's upright people who get destroyed, right? So you can, if later somebody accuses you and say, how dare you spoke like that to the person who was sitting shiva or got injured, and then you can claim that, no, I was actually saying that he did nothing wrong. And it could fit into these words, especially the second half, that you're not saying that you must have sinned, but the opposite. So it's ambiguous. That's my point. That this verses could be ambiguous.
Yeah.
And usually people who do that, they want to do it in that way. They know that if they just come out and with a terrible insult, then that sounds bad. That looks bad on them. But they try to cloak it in a way that's ambiguous. So, okay, we can skip the linguistic explanation. That's not so interesting. Why the word moneh or nech, it causes pain? Okay. I want to see one more example in the Talmud of what is deception. And this ona'at dvarim, again, this is ona'ah with words. So the Talmud in Baba Metzia brings this interesting example. Likewise, if donkey drivers are asking to purchase grain from somebody and he has none, one may not say to the drivers, go to so-and-so as he sells grain, if he knows about him that he never sold grain at all. He thereby causes the donkey drivers and the would-be seller anguish. So here I have difficulty, like, why would anybody even do that? So he must have gotten some, there must be some here unwritten or addition to interpret this section of the Gemara, that other person is selling something else and he has some kind of kickback system with him. So he's telling the donkey drivers, he knows they're looking for grain. He's sending them to someone who doesn't have grain but has something else to sell them, hoping that he'll succeed in selling them, let's say, milk. Let's keep it simple, right? So there's deception there, because you don't really want to help them get milk. You want to help your friend sell his milk, and you're taking these people who they're not looking for milk, they're looking for grain, and you're trying to get them to buy your friend's milk. So I think that's deception. We would all agree that's deceiving them. And again, it's kind of ambiguous. You can always claim, no, I was just trying to help them buy milk. Everybody needs milk. No, everybody needs to drink some milk. So I thought they would get a good deal with my friend.
What about the example of window shopping, so to speak, where you go
Oh,
in
excellent.
merchant?
So
Well, there's a specific thing in the Talmud about that.
But I
yeah,
thought,
yeah, let me show you. It's great that you asked.
There's a specific rule
Yeah, there it is.
not to take their
So it's a
time when you're
minority
having-
opinion.
Yeah,
What's interesting is it's a minority opinion, I think, because it's controversial whether it's really that much of a problem. Here right after this. Yeah, I didn't put it in the PowerPoint, but here it is. Rabbi Yehuda says, one may not even cast his eyes on the merchandise for sale, creating the impression that he is interested
Yeah.
at a time when he does not have the money to purchase it. So this is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, okay? Not the general opinion, because I think it's it's the whole idea of capitalism that you have to persuade me to buy your stuff. You have to really work hard. You have to, maybe only on the third time that I come to your store, I'll buy it. So show me that you have good deals. Show me that I get good customer service. But Rabbi Yehuda is very strict. He says, no, if you don't have the money on you and you don't intend to buy it that day, that's considered ona'ah. That's considered deception. So there is this opinion by Rabbi Yehuda. And it's interesting how halachic authorities dealt with it. There's very a lot of responsa, whether it's wrong, whether it's not wrong. And modern day rabbis are saying, no, we have to take into account how the modern day seller knows that people do window shopping. So it's not really deceiving them, right? You have to take into account the whole economic infrastructure. If all the sellers in the mall know that this is part and parcel of buying today, then you're not really deceiving anybody. But in that world, maybe in Rabbi Yehuda's world, there was no such thing as window shopping. You came to a store, you were expected to buy. Everybody expected you. You walked into the store, you were expected to buy something from that store. Okay. So thank you for bringing that up. Let's continue now with the Rambam. So the Rambam, I'll show you the examples that he brought. You tell me if you've seen it already. Oh, not this. No, sorry. So, wait, no, that's so he brings okay, so I'll take a shortcut. He brings the examples that we saw. He brings the examples of the donkey driver, the drivers. He brings the example of the convert. He brings the example of the person with suffering from disease or illness. And then he adds this example, which, okay, so let's read it. If a question is asked on a subject requiring expertise, you shouldn't ask someone who is not an expert in that field, what is the answer to this? What is your opinion on this? And I looked hard all over the place. There is no source for this, not in the Talmud, not in the Midrash. It seems like the Rambam felt he needs to add this example to explain the idea of deception with words, of ona'at dvarim. So how does that illuminate the whole idea of deception with words? So I think when you go to that when you go to that person who you know is not an expert, so that we have to do it in a classroom setting or in a lecture setting. Okay, there's a public that's viewing all this, and you come up in front of everybody, and you know that the person is only an expert on medieval history and that's Jewish medieval history, and you ask them something about the history of Zionism. Or you ask him something about Second Temple Judaism. And he says, I don't know. And you're embarrassing him. But
are these one person or two people that you're asking? That I'm not clear on that. You've already asked a question to an expert. And
No,
now you're going to someone who's a dimwit.
no. You're asking somebody who is an expert on subject A, but not on subject B, and you know that, and you're asking him on subject B. That's so somebody's giving a lecture about medieval Jewish history, and in front of everybody, you ask him about Second Temple period.
So you're embarrassing him in front of other people.
Mm-hmm.
And you're doing it in a way that you could always claim, no, I really was interested in learning about this. So there's real
Yeah.
deception going on here, right? You're pretending to show, first of all, you're showing off how you're an expert on Second Temple period to everybody. And you also want to show that this guy who's talking to everybody, was invited, maybe got an honorarium, he doesn't know anything. And so, and it's all cloaked in this innocent question, right? I have a question about this, I really want to know. I just want to gain knowledge. I'm an intellectual. So the Rambam, I think, with this example, shows us how, with words, so often we can hide our intentions, our real intentions, and it's very hard to prove. You can't go into this person's mind and prove that he knew that this person would be embarrassed. It's very hard to prove that. I'm sure there have been people asking questions of experts who were actually bona fide. They didn't know that they never tried to embarrass them. It was all kosher. They really thought that the person, for some reason, they thought he's an expert on subject B too. Right? He came to speak about subject A, and they thought, and so that's why they asked him. But here it's talking about a case where in your heart, in your mind, that only the person who asked the question will know whether it was a bona fide question seeking to gain knowledge, or the purpose of it was to embarrass the expert. So I think by giving this example, which he came up by himself, the Rambam, usually he just brings the examples of the Talmud, and here he illuminated this idea very, very sharply, I think, by giving us this example. It could be students in a classroom, right, trying to embarrass the teacher. The teacher, you claim to be teaching math, and then they ask him about calculus. He's teaching, I don't know, 8th grade math or not, math that doesn't require calculus, and they're asking him about calculus, trying to embarrass him in front of everybody. Kids will do that. So the Rambam brought us this example. I think it's a beautiful example. Okay, it seems an innocent question, but it's really, so now we have 2 minutes maybe. So the idea that sometimes words have so many ambiguous meanings, and you never know what the real meaning was. There was a famous song, and it could be interpreted in sometimes diametrically opposed ways. There was a song by Naomi Shemer, and it happened to her, where people took words that she wrote out of context and applied it to a political movement, very controversial political movement. And then the whole question is, did they do the right thing? So you have to ask 2 questions: whether she meant that, and also whether post facto she agrees with it. Right? So you have a line from a song, and you want to use it to promote your agenda. And that line really fits your agenda. Do you have to go back to the author and ask him, what do you think?
Yes.
Yeah,
Why?
it's their intellectual property.
But it's in the public domain.
Oh,
Yeah, but
that's
you-
different.
But it's not fair to take their art out of context to use it for a purpose that they did not want it used for.
I think that
But
happens
we
all
do
the
that
time.
all the time.
Yes.
I don't think,
No,
Gary, I
I
don't think,
agree. You're implying that your political agenda is also theirs, and they actually might be opposed to it, right? So there's deception here. It's not that you're saying it's fine that you believe in let's take a controversial issue of abortion, and you take some poetry line. It's perfectly fine that you're stating your opinion, but now by quoting a living author, somebody who's alive, you're implying that they, whatever the case is, support or oppose abortion laws when they don't. right? So there's deception here because they're a very well recognized figure. They're famous, and now they'll be tarnished with a political position that they never had any intention. They actually maybe even opposed, right? There's three options actually. They can either agree. If you know, let's say you know that they are pro-choice and you're pro-choice and you use their line, great. So probably you don't even have to ask. They could be opposed. They could be, pro-life, and I think it's wrong. It's a deception. And then there's also neutral, like you don't know what their opinion on the subject is. And I still think so. That happened in a song of Naomi Shemer, which we're going to cover next week. It's very interesting. It's very, very interesting how that happened to her. All right, so join us. Come back next week. And
Very good.
all right.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Shemai.